Hello and welcome to the session. Now our title today is Not Barred, Analysing Shakespearean Drama. Now I'm Mr. Craven, Senior Director of English for NET, and today we're going to be engaging with the delights of Shakespeare's plays. Now my intention today is to look at Shakespeare as a man and as a writer, including his legacy and his influence. We're also going to try and explore Shakespeare's writing in its context and evaluate the extent to which we need to understand that context. We're going to try and unpack some of the key features of his style, to consider how we work with a script on the page as well as on the stage, and also to look at how we can help make it all seem rather less threatening for our students. That's what I've described on the overview as getting past the help, not Shakespeare reaction from students. Now that is an ambitious list of things to cover. I'll also admit at the outset that I adore Shakespeare as a writer. He's very much one of my literary loves, so I apologise in advance for any geeking out over the bard. So, who was Shakespeare? Now, this sounds like a simple question, and to an extent, it is. However, one of the first points to flag up is the perspective students have of who Shakespeare was. Now, for the majority of students, Shakespeare wasn't a person. He's a lot of old words on a page and some confusing grammar. They don't talk about studying Shakespeare's plays, they talk about studying Shakespeare, liking Shakespeare, hating Shakespeare. And there are some issues with that. For one thing, it views Shakespeare as a construct of the text that he wrote, and therefore as some kind of unapproachable monolith, untouchable, beyond the ken of we mere mortals. His plays, then, being the inviolable word of the bard, different from and separate to anything written by anyone else, and therefore existing in isolation from the rest of English literature. For another, it gets away from the human side of Shakespeare, the writer making a living from his skill, experimenting with ideas, exploring issues, working within his context, choosing his language. If he's Shakespeare, the bard, he's untouchable, he's unreachable. If he's this bloke called Shakespeare who wrote some stuff, well, him we can work with. And that means we can also then analyse his writing in itself and within its context, and yes, hence the title of this session. Not barred. Now Shakespeare was, clearly, a human being, but his life is quite a mixture of the known, the unknown, and the assumed. For example, he wasn't christened William Shakespeare. We don't know for definite when he was born. We don't know for definite what he looked like. We don't know for definite exactly how many texts he wrote, and how much of some of them. And, of course, the way we spell his name, he, well, generally didn't. Now, William Shakespeare was born in Stratford in April 1564, although we don't know the actual day. Custom has it that he was born on the 23rd of April, but that's assumed thanks to his baptism being recorded on the 26th of April, because it was usually 2 to 3 days after the birth, and also because of the evocative neatness of him dying on the 23rd of April 1616, that old he died on his birthday thing. Now Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, was a glover and a prominent businessman, and Shakespeare's mother, Mary Arden, was the youngest daughter of a gentleman farmer. Now William probably went to school in Stratford. His father's local status meant that that was certainly possible, and the school in Stratford was very, very good. I mean, several of the masters there went on to teach at prestigious universities. Now we can't be sure that William was a student there, since no records exist, but his articulacy, his wide reference frames, and that sort of thing would suggest quite strongly that he did. Now William married the presumably pregnant Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years his senior, in 1582, with their first child arriving a few months after the wedding. Now somehow William found his way to London, and he joined the theatrical scene, and by about 1592 was reasonably established and known as an actor and as a playwright, even receiving some flack for apparent plagiarism in a written rant by an older playwright. William was successful. He ended up as part owner of the most successful theatre troupe in London, originally called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and then eventually becoming the King's Men after a change in their sponsor. And also he part owned as a result their theatre, the Globe, which was built in 1599. Now William was financially successful. He ended up owning property in Stratford, although he spent his working life in London and didn't, the belief goes, even make it back to Stratford for his son Hamlet's funeral. During Shakespeare's career, he was a successful poet, first, particularly a sonnet writer, and he went on to produce somewhere between about 38 and 40 plays, not all of which still exist, and some of which exist in multiple, slightly conflicting versions. As of about 1613, Shakespeare retired to Stratford, and he lived off the proceeds of his earnings and of his investments, and he died then in 1616, aged 52. Now that was more or less the safe bit. Now to turn back to the more questionable side of things. Now William Shakespeare wasn't christened William Shakespeare, but Guilianus Shakespeare, which is the Latin version of his name. We only have a dozen words or so written in his own handwriting, almost all of which are just versions of his own name on various legal documents. But in fact, he only spelt his surname the way we now spell it once in terms of surviving records. On others, he's Shakespeare, 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 and other records even suggest he may also have been called Shagspur and Shakeshaft at various points, both of which I would hesitate to mention to anything less than a very mature group of students. There are no portraits definitely of Shakespeare that we are certain were produced during his lifetime. All the pictures we see as being Shakespeare were painted either afterwards or during his lifetime and assumed to be him, but without any real proof. Now, several of the plays we now class as Shakespeare's appear to have been partially or fully collaboratively written with other playwrights, so some of the witches' content from Macbeth, for example. And at least one play that we know Shakespeare wrote has been lost altogether. Other plays that he wrote, such as Hamlet, appear in several quite different versions, some pirated, some due to touring demands and adaptations, some based on reconstructions or just edits. There's still more plays, such as Edward III and the play Sir Thomas More, are believed by some to have been written entirely or partially by Shakespeare, but no one's quite sure. And Shakespeare isn't, or certainly hasn't, always been universally admired. He was, for example, a near contemporary of Christopher Marlowe, another Elizabethan playwright, and Marlowe was arguably more popular than Shakespeare and more successful at the time of his death, aged 29. It's perfectly possible that if Marlowe hadn't ended up stabbed through the eye in a brawl over paying a bill in a tavern, that it would be Marlowe we were studying right now rather than Shakespeare. I mean, linked to this, there's also a significant movement that believes that William Shakespeare wasn't even the author of his own plays, with people suggesting Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, or a secretly still alive Christopher Marlowe, or even Queen Elizabeth herself as the writer. Shakespeare's work also fell out of fashion for much of the 17th and 18th centuries, with some writers even going so far as to rewrite the ending of some of his plays. The most popular version of King Lear for over a century, for example, was rewritten to provide a happy ending. The mind boggles. And again we return to the pun, not bard. So again, who was Shakespeare? Well, he was a real person. Despite his genius, Shakespeare probably ended up in London thanks to his father's bankruptcy. He had a habit, it seems, of borrowing storylines and even quotations from other sources. He was very skilled at writing what was popular at the time. He wrote for and impressed the right people, he invested his money wisely, and he lived off the profits from his land ownership. He may also have contributed to the King James Bible. He may have influenced the creation of knock-knock jokes and the your mum put down. There's a rather inappropriate anecdote from a law student's diary written during Shakespeare's lifetime about Shakespeare as William the Conqueror, boasting about his dalliance with a lady who had intended to dally with Shakespeare's friend Burbage. Shakespeare's friends and his fellow actors were arrested numerous times for brawling in the streets, putting their expert stage swordsmanship to work, and Shakespeare and his friends even, it seems, more or less physically stole the building. This isn't some untouchable, sacred figure. It's a real, flawed person in a real, flawed time. There's also a temptation sometimes to modernise Shakespeare, to see him as anachronistically representing our modern values of tolerance, equality, democracy, the rights of the oppressed, and so on. And certainly these are all relevant to and explored in his plays. However, Shakespeare was also a man trying to make his way in the world, someone with a growing family back in Stratford to support, and someone who saw friends and contemporaries imprisoned or even killed for pushing the boundaries too far in their writing. As such, it's important to acknowledge that he knows when to stop. His characters challenge the status quo, of course they do. They interrogate beliefs and values, but they also end up resolved in such a way as to safely restore and therefore safely reinforce stability and the norm. Juliet, for example, can disobey her father and seek out her own destiny, but dies. Lady Macbeth takes control of her life. She dominates her husband and dies. Desdemona chooses the man that she loves. She breaks social conventions and dies. Hermia, Lysander, Demetrius and Helena, well, they get what they want, but only when permitted by the ultimate patriarchal authority figure, Theseus. And that is, by the way, a key difference between tragedy and comedy in Shakespeare's time. The happy resolution in which the protagonists don't die. Now, Shakespeare is happy to explore and interrogate society through his works, but he also has a very close eye on where his paychecks are coming from and who in authority he needs to keep on side. Now, one key difficulty with Shakespeare is that we know lots of bits and yet not a lot about the actual man. After all, we end up trying to understand Shakespeare through his writings, and these are always ventriloquized, Shakespeare speaking through the voices of others. It's dangerous to make assumptions on that basis. I mean, after all, if we go by those, Shakespeare was male, female, human, fairy, monster, king, heterosexual, homosexual, old, young, murderer, victim, English, Scottish, Welsh, French, Italian, villain, hero, the list could go on. Now that itself is something useful. Shakespeare the individual, the writer, can be whatever we want to construct him as being. Feminist? Fine. Misogynist? Yep. Anti-monarchist? Fine. A keen believer in Queen and country? No problem. Atheist? Fine. A devout Roman Catholic? Go for it. It's for this reason that often when we look for things in Shakespeare's plays, it can feel as though the plays are simply reflecting our own perspectives and biases and ideas back at us. In a practical sense, it's important to see Shakespeare as a human being, as a writer, someone constructing texts through choices and voices, a representative and a product of his time, but also someone whose work transcends time. He's all these things. And don't forget that amongst all the superb, beautiful, extraordinary writing, there are some absolute stinkers. If you don't believe me, we'll check out Two Gentlemen of Verona, Act 5, Scene 4, or the character in The Winter's Tale that's chased off the stage by a bear that appears from nowhere, or Philemon in Pericles, whose only contribution is to say, "Doth my lord call?" and then run off stage never to be seen again, or the weird Morris dancing in the Morris dance thing in Two Noble Kinsmen, or the whole of Titus Andronicus, which is essentially Shakespeare writing some sort of brutal early Tarantino-style revenge saga. So what's the big deal? And let's be clear, I mean, Shakespeare is a big deal. Since the late 18th century, he's been firmly established as almost uniquely, universally revered. And that is universally, as in across the world. His plays are more widely performed, they're more widely read and studied than more or less any other writer. They've generated more literary and academic criticism than any other writer, and they've been translated into more languages than almost any other texts. Now, in addition to being clearly ridiculously talented, Shakespeare managed to hit the sweet spot of the golden age of Renaissance culture, and theatre in particular, in England. And poetry and playwriting were the two key genres that seemed to encapsulate the time. His plays are, as a result, some of the most complex, complete, accessible and successful printed texts. And Shakespeare has, again as a result, become the writer who seems to best represent that period in history. As a writer, he also embeds and embodies the legacy of the writers before him. We can trace many of the influences, but he also built on, developed, subverted and added to the play as a genre. He's inspired poets from Coleridge to Tennyson, novelists from Hardy to Dickens, say, composers of operas, painters, and even the work of the founder of modern psychology, Sigmund Freud. Now, because Shakespeare's works are some of the few that survive from the time, They also provide the first written or printed record of huge amounts of words that we now use in English, some of which Shakespeare may even have actually invented, from bedazzled to assassination, from arming yourself to swagger or zany. A whole range of Shakespeare's phrases have also found their way into modern speech, from waiting with bated breath and something being a foregone conclusion, to vanish into thin air, a method to my madness, a wild goose chase, to break the ice, to wear my heart upon my sleeve, the devil incarnate. Students are speaking Shakespeare's English without even realizing it. And because Shakespeare had a real skill for creating or reproducing engaging storylines, along with imaginative language use, along with beautifully turned phrasing and a perceptive engagement with human behaviour, his plays have also been reimagined for each successive generation. So from the Romantics finding the darkness of Shakespeare's psychological exploration and the scope of some of his landscapes appealing, through to the psychedelic indulgences of some of the 60s and 70s playing companies, finding expression in A Midsummer Night's Dream. You can move across to Cold War era Eastern European nations, recognising parallels in King Lear. Nelson Mandela, for example, kept a copy of Shakespeare's collected works in his cell on Robben Island for 20 years. And right the way through to modern audiences, where we see Juliet as a sympathetic modern teenager, or representing Richard III, say, as a Nazi-era study in power. And it's this perception of Shakespeare's writing that gives us Romeo and Juliet as a West Side Story style conflict in Baz Luhrmann's film version. And even more than that, Shakespeare's plays have influenced other examples in modern culture. Sons of Anarchy was Hamlet with motorbikes. Claire Underwood in House of Cards was Lady Macbeth to Frank Underwood, Richard III. The Lion King is a blend of Macbeth and Hamlet. The villainous parrot in Disney's Aladdin is Iago, the corruptive antagonist of Othello. When the X-Men needed someone inhuman seeming, he's Caliban from The Tempest. And what is Noughts and Crosses if not Romeo and Juliet reimagined? Romeo and Juliet gave rise to Nomeo and Juliet, and even to the zombie movie Warm Bodies. When the choir in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban sing, it's lifted directly from Macbeth. When an Italian couple met across balconies during the 2020 lockdown, they were dubbed a modern-day Romeo and Juliet by the press. Hip-hop artist Akala has dubbed himself the Black Shakespeare, and his single comedy-tragedy history contains the titles of, I think, 27 different Shakespeare play titles. With Shakespeare, his work, his life, his words, they've become embedded in our language, in our lives and in our culture, even for people who have never watched any of his plays or even read one of his poems. So let's talk about Shakespeare in context. Now, whenever students talk about Shakespeare, there are certain go-to points that they fall back on. Men were in charge, women were oppressed, young people didn't have any rights, everyone was religious, people were really poor, kings were appointed by God, and so on. Now, none of those is wrong. In fact, in basic terms, they're essentially right. Elizabethan and Jacobean England were essentially very hierarchical, very patriarchal societies. However, it's important not to ignore the fact that for the majority of Shakespeare's life, the person on the throne was a queen, not a king. Now, women were viewed as and treated as inferior. They were oppressed. They were blamed for original sin in terms of Eve tempting Adam to eat the forbidden fruit. And they were observed as suffering from a whole range of diseases as punishment for exactly that. Women were viewed as weaker, as less morally and physically robust, as less intelligent, as less worthy, as less. Women couldn't vote in parliamentary or mayoral elections. They couldn't be justices, lawyers, mayors, aldermen. They could be surgeons, but there's a record of only, I think, one woman surgeon in the whole of Elizabeth's reign. Women couldn't do business unless it was with their husbands. They couldn't own property independently unless they were widowed. Women couldn't enter into contracts without the husband's consent. They couldn't allow anyone outside the family into the home without the husband's permission. They could be beaten by their husbands as much as those husbands saw fit, as long as no one actually died. An unfaithful man was unremarkable, almost an expectation. An unfaithful woman was castigated, humiliated, and punished. Except in exceptional circumstances, women couldn't choose who to marry. They worked, if not in the aristocracy, but often in the lower classes, often as much as the men did, and often alongside their husbands. And women of all social classes ran households, oversaw or did the cooking, the cleaning, raised the children or supervised those who did raise the children, and they ran a serious risk of dying in childbirth. Now obviously a lot of this would depend and vary to a degree in terms of their precise social position, but there are definite trends. And let's return to the fact that it's a queen on the throne. Now for most of Shakespeare's life and career, this apparently masculine, patriarchal society is ruled relatively effectively by one of the few English monarchs with instant name recognition among the modern public, Elizabeth I. Under her rule, England stabilised its national church, secured its borders, established itself once again as a major force within Europe in terms of militarily, nautically, politically, economically, culturally, religiously. England saw off the Spanish Armada, the narrative goes, explored new lands, and yet this female ruler's power was still enacted predominantly through masculine channels, through autocratic rule, through force, through financial and cultural dominance, because she still had to operate within patriarchal structures and systems. A queen England may have had, but its social, political, legal, economic, religious and military facets were still delineated patriarchally. There's no surprise that in one of her most famous speeches, Elizabeth would claim, it seems, to have the heart and stomach of a king. Now, is any of this essential for our understanding of Hermia, Helena and Hippolyta in A Midsummer Night's Dream, of Desdemona, Emilia and Bianca in Othello, of Juliet and Lady Capulet in Romeo and Juliet, of Lady Macbeth, Lady Macduff in Macbeth? No. But it can help to shape our understanding of their behaviours and their choices in those texts. After all, Juliet, who is trapped into taking the potion given by Friar Lawrence in Act 4, is viewed very differently by an audience who understand the dramatically limiting and oppressive context in which Shakespeare was writing, as opposed to a modern teenager who can't see why Juliet doesn't just, mouth off to her parents and run away. A Lady Macbeth who cannot succeed independently because of her time, and who faces barriers and limitations everywhere she turns, is viewed very differently to a Lady Macbeth from a modern perspective, where she's simply weak, too scared to stand up for and succeed as herself. Now obviously there's always, and very much so in many of the plays, the flip side of this. Male characters operating within a stereotypically masculine sphere. Aegeus, for example, threatened so much by his daughter's independence and the damage to his reputation that he's willing for her to die. Demetrius, operating within a social system in which women are largely seen as a medium of exchange, and who, by the standards of the time at least, does things with Hermia more or less the right way. Iago, so threatened by the sexually and hierarchically assertive dominance of other characters, he's willing to cause the deaths of complete innocents. Romeo, seen by his friends as a man's man who will fight Tybalt, those same friends who see women as simply objects of physical desire, as items to be possessed. There's Lord Capulet, of course, Aegeus-like in his concern about his reputation and his willingness to sacrifice. Macbeth, constantly undermined by his wife's interrogation of his masculinity in terms of his willingness to act and of course, of his fertility. To be a man in Elizabethan England, Shakespeare seems to be saying to us, is to be seen to be dominating, assertive, violent, sexually controlling, territorial, objectifying women and jealously guarding reputation. Though it's interesting that the most sympathetic characters are often those who defy social conventions in this sense, Lysander, Othello, Romeo, and those who represent, who embody that stereotypical masculinity of the time, are quite often the ones who end most badly. There's also the gender play and the ambiguity that runs subversively through Shakespeare's plays. His actors, as we know, were all male. Women weren't allowed on the stage, and Shakespeare uses this. He plays with it, from the mechanicals in A Midsummer Night's Dream, through Lord Capulet offering to play the woman for this once in Romeo and Juliet, to Lady Macbeth asking the spirits to unsex me here, to the witches having beards. There's a fluidity to the sense of self, an exploratory and self-constructive sense of who we are, including in terms of gender. And again, is this essential? No, but it's enriching to know about and to consider. And what about religion and kingship? Now, there seems little doubt that religion and what we would class as superstition were a central part of Elizabethan and Jacobean life, and they thus find their way frequently into the plays. I mean, there are records of people accused of atheism, and the majority of the original audience would have seen that as being almost equivalent to Satanism. To be without God, runs the logic, is either to have rejected him or to have been rejected by him. And the question then of whether God exists simply wouldn't occur for the majority of people. Now, Christopher Marlowe, who we mentioned earlier, is an exception, assumed to have been some sort of strange collation of ritualistically Roman Catholic and religiously atheist. However, at a time when people were fined for failing to attend church, and when people had, in living memory, been executed for going against the established religion of the state, it's hard to get a full picture of this. Now, certainly religion was something of which an original audience would have been only too aware. The shared reference frame of this, of course, would have connected them with references in Shakespeare's writing that many people now would miss. So when Macduff, for example, tells Malcolm in Act 4 that the Queen died every day she lived, he's paraphrasing 1 Corinthians 15, verse 31, which is, in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die daily. Now, obviously, this would sail right over the heads of the majority of modern audience members, but it's something that would have resonated more for many of the original viewers. And religion is inextricably intertwined with kingship. Thanks to Henry VIII's separation of the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church, and then left to his daughter Elizabeth to see through and formalise, the monarch now stands as the single head of the Church. And this isn't simply a ceremonial role, as it can often seem to be now. The traditions from which Protestantism grew, and against which it then reacted, held the priests to be directly interceding with the Almighty on behalf of the people they served. And the monarch, the king or the queen, becomes that figure for an entire country, in a sense, the link in the great chain of being between the earthly and the heavenly realms. And the belief propagated by the church and the state is of everyone and everything operating within a great chain of being. Everything linked and carefully situated in a grand overarching design ordained by the Almighty and mirrored at each stage, with God at the top of the heavenly part of the chain, the equivalent then of the king or the queen, the human part of the chain, and every part of existence having its own little hierarchy. So the oak tree, for example, at or near the top of the trees, down to, say, moss at the bottom of the plants. In terms of birds, you've got raptors such as hawks at or near the top of the birds, down to wrens or sparrows around the bottom. And that's why the reference in Macbeth to the falcon towering in her pride of place being killed by a mousing owl is shocking. The falcon is above the owl in terms of the great chain of being, and the owl has clearly forgotten its place, perhaps egged on by Lady Owl questioning his owly virility. Your station in life dictates everything. The food you're allowed to eat, the animals you're allowed to own, the cloths and the clothing you're allowed to wear. And the chain image is deliberate. Disrupt the chain, take out any link from it, and the whole system falls apart. Say seek to, for example, subvert authority or to reach beyond your station in life, and you run the risk of far wider implications in society. And when that disruption is at or near the top of the human chain, the king or the queen, say, then the whole of the physical, the human, the natural world suffers. And we see that in Macbeth only too clearly. And who chooses the king? Who chooses God's representative on earth? Well, God, obviously. And that means it's not for humankind to judge or to control. The divine right of kings. Now, in Shakespeare's time, it's against the law not just to plot the death of the king or the queen, but even to discuss the death of the king or the queen. And notice that Shakespeare's kings typically die off stage. Death, especially of a king, just as with sex, is too shocking for an audience to see, and too dangerous for a playing company to show. Actors are imprisoned, they're tortured, and even killed for far less. And who does this benefit? Well, the monarch and the church, obviously, reinforcing their control, their special privileged status, beyond question or reproach. And in the plays we study, that's Theseus, it's the Duke of Venice, it's Prince Aeschylus, it's Duncan. Allow someone to subvert the system, to go against the order of things, as with Hermia, Helena, Lysander, Othello, Desdemona, Iago, Romeo, Juliet, Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and they must be brought back into line, forced to conform and submit, killed, a sacrifice to the normative social order, or with their transgression allowed but within key limits before submitting once again to the established order. In a sense, this is, to an extent, a useful function of the theatre at the time. It's a safe space in which transgression can, to a carefully moderated extent, be allowed, explored, and then safely resolved, ready to return to society. It's clear that the Elizabethan and Jacobean nobility and the monarchy understood the power of the theatre. Playwrights were often paid to produce short dramas in which actual kings and queens would appear and show their power, court masks. Macbeth is often seen as a long propaganda piece for King James, and one of Elizabeth's favourites, the Earl of Essex, tried to use a performance of Shakespeare's play Richard II to incite a rebellion against the Queen. He failed, ended badly, and Shakespeare played it rather safe in his subsequent literary endeavours. Now, Shakespeare's world is one riddled with what we would class as superstition. The fairies that appear in A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, wouldn't be seen by an original audience as just silly fictions, but as powerful spirits that lie beyond our understanding. The same is true of the witches and their spirits in Macbeth. The dying curse of a character such as Mercutio, as an alternative example, would also be seen as carrying special power. Semi-magical potions could give the appearance of death. Stars represented the divine plan to those that could read them, and why not? Who is to say that the sudden appearance of thunder, lightning and rain wasn't the result of supernatural interference? That an unexpected illness wasn't actually a curse? That the herbal remedy someone had used to cure themselves wasn't actually a magical concoction? That the death of someone evil wasn't divine justice? Now, King James, of course, was only too aware of this. He was obsessed with witchcraft, with devils and demons, and he earnestly convinced himself and others of them plotting to take his life. It's no accident that Shakespeare should write a play about Scotland, about witches, and about the dangers of killing or rebelling against a king, just after James, who is an insecure Scottish king with an obsession with witches, should come to the throne. Oh, and, of course, including James's supposed ancestor Banquo, well, icing on the kingly cake. Now, cliched though it may be, the fear of change, of transformation, of translation, is a source of both the magic and also the mistrust associated with the theatre at the time. In plays such as those we study, some small costume items, the odd role signifier, the occasional makeup or prop, and suddenly the actors are transformed into an entirely different character, transported to an entirely different location. Now this, of course, for an audience largely without any access to other forms of entertainment, largely illiterate, and with books almost unachievably expensive, where woodcuts were beyond the financial reach of the common person, where artificial light was too expensive to use. This, the theatre, is escapism. It's a taste of the foreign, the taboo, the exotic, the erotic. Now, bear-baiting, cockfighting, public executions, they were key forms of entertainment, but increasingly those paled in status in comparison to the theatre, and that can be clearly seen by the number of people attending the plays. And actors, by the very nature of their craft, retain some of the transformative magic of the supernatural, at the same time that they appear to transgress the boundaries that society imposes. Men performing as women, changing their age or nationality, challenging kings, stealing thrones, disobeying parents, and everything in between. Now, popular though the theatre was in Shakespeare's time, it was also, for these reasons, also widely associated with immorality and the divine retribution of the plague. And just as a final point about the context, going to the theatre for an Elizabethan or Jacobean audience was, of course, dramatically different to now. The Globe Theatre could probably have housed somewhere in the region of 3,000 people, and it was essentially, as you'll know from any pictures you've seen, and obviously the picture on the screen, it was essentially a 20-sided polygon with 3 levels. The roof in the centre was open to the elements so that light could be let in. I mean, after all, there wasn't any artificial lighting in Shakespeare's time. So performances would have taken place in the afternoon, with many of the audience sneaking away from their working day to attend. Now, that means that anything about light and dark, about day, night, outside, inside, these things need to be built into the script. They can't be conveyed through scenery, through special effects, or through lighting effects, because, well, there wasn't really very much of any of those things. That said, the players would have had some quite impressive costumes passed on to them by their benefactors, and particularly their patrons, and then reused for the various plays. So Romeo, for example, could quite possibly have worn the exact same costume as Lysander, as Malcolm, as Othello. Now, the majority of people, those paying a penny, would have stood in front of the stage, and they were therefore known as the groundlings, because they stood on the ground, or the stinkers, for obvious reasons as a result. So men and women of what we'd now call the working and the middle class would have queued up to watch a play, with the wealthier audience members paying to have a seat around the side, perhaps even with a cushion. Luxury. Now, Shakespeare's company would also have performed command performances for nobles, or even for the Queen or the King in their courts, which is why we get a mix of characters. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, we get both Theseus and his court, and we get the rude mechanicals, the workmen. In Othello, we have both the Duke of Venice and Iago out in the town. We see both Prince Aeschylus and Peter, both Macbeth and the porter. Shakespeare's careful to involve and to include something for everyone. And that's also true of the language. Now, there may be lots of beautifully self-reflective speeches from Romeo, but there's also in that play a long string of penis jokes from Samson and Gregory, and also from Mercutio and Benvolio. Now, audiences watching the plays would have been noisy, with actors needing to work hard to keep their attention. Food and buckets for toileting would have been passed around during performances. Plays were performed by a small, pretty consistent group of men, the playing company. And despite what Tom Stoppard's excellent Shakespeare in Love would have us believe, women didn't appear on stage probably until about 1660, with the first official actress, in fact, playing the role of Desdemona in Othello. Now, each actor in the company specialised in certain kinds of roles. Burbage, Shakespeare's friend, the leading actor, would have been the male lead in many of his plays. He would have been Hamlet, Othello, Richard III, Lear. Funny parts, such as, say, Peter, the porter, Bottom, would have been played by the resident comedian, the actor sometimes allowed to improvise during a performance. Another actor would have specialised in mature female roles, such as Lady Capulet, as Lady Macbeth, Titania. Younger female roles would have been played by boys. A key reason for the frequent lack of developed female characters in the plays. They were less experienced actors. Shakespeare himself probably played the roles of older men, such as King Duncan, Hamlet's father's ghost, and so on. Most actors would have played multiple roles within a production, dying as a character one moment, and then reappearing as somebody completely different in the next scene. Now, this wasn't some kind of highbrow, stuck-up, nose-to-the-ceiling, elitist form of artistic expression. It was populist, it was popular, fully aware of its own commercial appeal, but also reaching extraordinary artistic heights despite, or perhaps even because, of all of this. There's a running idea that if Shakespeare were alive now, he would be writing for soap operas, scripting EastEnders, perhaps, or similar. For others, Shakespeare would have been a Hollywood scriptwriter, masterminding the Marvel movies, or perhaps even, as comedian Mitch Benn would have us believe, almost like an Eminem figure, verbally dexterous, alive to the rhythms of language, and pushing controversy without ever quite losing commercial appeal. Now, after Shakespeare died, some of his fellow players managed to put his plays into a set now known as the First Folio, which was published in 1623. And to be honest, without that First Folio, we probably wouldn't have Shakespeare's plays. Now, in the preface to that First Folio, Shakespeare's friend and fellow playwright, Ben Jonson, described Shakespeare as soul of the age, and as not of an age, but for all time. And I think Jonson hits the nail on the head there. Shakespeare was a writer both of his time and of every time. Is it essential to know his contexts? Well, no, or at least rarely. Can it be enriching and developmental to situate Shakespeare within his time? Well, yes, absolutely. So let's talk about Shakespeare's language and some of the key features, techniques, and so on that we need to be aware of when we analyse Shakespeare's works. Now, many of them, you'll spot almost instantly, are the same as poetry, and there is a significant overlap between the two forms. Shakespeare, as we know, was a successful poet before he was a successful playwright. Now, both poetry and plays in Shakespeare's time are written in verse, rhyming verse for poetry, blank, that is non-rhyming verse for drama. The usual meter is, of course, those 10-syllable lines that we call iambic pentameter. Now, for the non-specialists, all this means is that they're written using these 2-syllable units called iambs, which consist of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and that there are 5 of them. So, when, for example, Romeo says, "But soft what light through yonder window breaks," we find ourselves unthinkingly emphasizing every second syllable, every second beat. But soft what light through yonder window breaks. It's the rhythm that at the time best fit English speech, and still does to an extent, although obviously for the initiated among you, there's an argument to be made that our speech is becoming more archaic as we become more Atlanticized. Now, when Shakespeare wants a line to be more dramatic, sometimes the line sees that first syllable emphasized, so that I am reversed. So when Tybalt says, "Turn thee, Benvolio, look upon thy death," it's almost impossible not to emphasize that first syllable, the imperative turn. Equally, when characters are confused or troubled, the rhythms of their speech can become less settled, more varied. So when Macbeth, confronted by Banquo's ghost, says, "Dare me to the desert with thy sword, if trembling I inhabit then, protest me the baby of a girl. Hence, horrible shadow, unreal mockery, hence." We can force it into an iambic rhythm, but it clearly doesn't want to be. Shakespeare wants a speech like that to feel unsettled, almost clumsy in Macbeth's mouth, and reinforced, of course, by the flowing on of the sentence from me to the, allowing for a more expressive, more natural spoken style. Now, this flowing on from line to line is called enjambment, right, or enjambment. You often find students calling it enjambment. As long as they spell it right, it doesn't really matter. Now, the opposite of enjambment, in a sense, is that slicing of the line, usually put with punctuation, as in the full stop after girl here. Now, that break in a line of verse is called a caesura, and more of that in a few minutes. Now, characters don't always get to keep a whole line of verse to themselves. For example, when Benvolio and Romeo bounce off each other in Act 1, Scene 1, Benvolio's line, "Good morrow, cousin," is only 5 syllables. Romeo's response, providing the other 5 syllables then, is "the day so young?" So between the two of them, they construct a whole 10-syllable line. Now, it shows a connection between them. They're sharing a line, but it also gives the scene rapidity of interplay and rhythm. And it's why sometimes short lines are indented on the page. It's because what those lines are is the second half of the syllabic count from the first line. And those shared lines are something we often see when Shakespeare wants a sense of pace or fragmentation. So if you look, for example, at Act 2, Scene 2 of Macbeth, and the interaction in that scene between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Macbeth says, "I have done the deed, didst thou not hear a noise?" There you go, fine, full line. And Lady Macbeth responds, "I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry." Full line, there we go. And then, "Did you not speak? When? Now, as I descended. Aye, hark." It's all divided up, it's all in bits, even though it does add up to those full, still metrical lines of 10 syllables. It's jumpy, it's uncomfortable, it's bitty. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you shared lines, also known as stickomithic partial lines, although that's not really a term students need to know. Shared lines. It's also worth looking for where lines are end-stopped versus where there's enjambment in terms of a character's thoughts and feelings. And the feeling of the two is very, very different. If you compare, for example, Juliet's beautifully end-stopped, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hands too much," which manly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Compare that to Romeo's, later on. "This gentleman, the prince's near ally, my very friend, hath got his mortal hurt in my behalf. My reputation stained with Tybalt's slander, Tybalt that an hour hath been my kinsman." There's less control, there's greater immediacy in the latter, and that's reflecting Romeo's emotional state, just as with Macbeth's speech earlier. Now, to return to the verse issue, there are points when characters rhyme. So, for example, when Macbeth asks that, "Stars hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires. The eye wink at the hand, yet let that be which the eye fears when it is done to see." Now, Shakespeare's clearly offering us some rhyming couplets. Yeah, we get fires and desires, B and C. Now, there are a few theories as to why. For one, it's to make a quotation stand out. It's a key moment, a key phrase, an image, an idea that Shakespeare wants the audience to catch. And it would be caught because we'd be hearing it, remember, as an audience, not reading it on the page. On a more practical level, there's also the idea that rhymes such as these act as stage directions. They're an auditory prompt for another actor to prepare for their entrance, something essential when working with a partially literate acting troupe, and with only one person, the prompt, allowed the full version of the text. So what separates Shakespeare's style from other writers of the same time? Well, if you turn to almost any other playwright from the period, a Marlowe, a Johnson, students would struggle to see the difference. The most common genres for all of them are tragedies, comedies, and histories. Plays are almost exclusively written in blank verse, particularly thanks to the popularity of Marlowe's work, and he was a key influence with that. Most of these plays follow something approaching the 5-act structure. There's a lot of Greek and Roman mythology woven into the references. There are lengthy speeches relying on dense rhetorical language and sometimes very stretched and rather artificial metaphors. Now, more or less all of these things apply to Shakespeare, and as at the start of the session, it's important to recognise Shakespeare as, in some ways, a writer of his time and influenced by his time, rather than being some kind of complete anomaly, kind of a black swan of Avon. Though it's also hard to fully identify where Shakespeare, as an influential playwright, is shaping the genre rather than simply reflecting wider changes. Now, where we can see a sense of Shakespeare being distinctive is in the spoken style that develops throughout his plays. Early on, there's a clear pandering to actorly egos, with a reliance on end-stop lines, a complex and bombastic style that leading actors would have loved, but that lend themselves less perhaps to subtlety, to sensitivity, to nuance, and that kind of really full emotional engagement from an audience member. Where Shakespeare really comes into his own from about the 1590s onwards, there's a far clearer grasp of the self-awareness of characters, a freer, a more natural, more expressive style, encouraging delivery that reflects the actual content of the speech rather than the cleverness of the writer. And we see that, in those plays of 1594, 1595 onwards. Now, part of this is, as we've already seen, the wider play of caesuras and enjambments, rather than being trapped by the conventions of end-stopped iambic pentameter. This also allows Shakespeare to develop distinctive voices for his characters, and thus more distinctive styles. So if you contrast, for example, the manipulative smoothness of a Lysander with the articulate honesty of an Othello, the slightly petulant fury of Hermia with the cold cruelty of Lady Macbeth, the effect is very different. Now, Shakespeare does use blank verse for around 3/4 of the text in his plays, but he also mixes this up with rhyming verse to reflect key moments, or to emphasise the different eerie qualities of, say, the witches, where almost all of their speech sounds like a spell being cast, but also with sections in prose to reflect lower social class, such as with the porter, for example, or the mechanicals in A Midsummer Night's Dream, or Peter, or someone's descent into madness, where they lose their respect and their social status, as with Hamlet. Now, Shakespeare also became very skilled at using cohesive image systems throughout his plays. So, for example, the use of light and dark running all the way through Romeo and Juliet, with light also linking to heat and to passion, and darkness also linking out, webbing out into coldness, death, and the grave. Equally, the tension between the artificial and the natural in A Midsummer Night's Dream, of blood in Macbeth. Now, images for Shakespeare are useful signposts for spotting themes on the move. Celestial bodies, such as the sun, moon, and stars, link to the theme of fate or hierarchical control, as with Romeo insisting that I defy you stars, or Macbeth ordering stars to hide your fires. Clothing, linking to the theme of appearance and reality. We've got Macbeth wearing a giant's robe on a dwarfish thief, or Iago describing those who are trimmed in forms and visages of duty, but lined with their own coats. And that's, of course, why Iago isn't yet wearing my heart upon my sleeve. Now, Shakespeare also got very good at structuring, careful to open his plays with something striking and vivid. The relational tension that sets off A Midsummer Night's Dream, for example, the witches and the battle in Macbeth, the chorus and the brawl in Romeo and Juliet, the self-serving manipulation of Iago in Othello. But Shakespeare's also careful to offset huge, noisy, busy scenes with smaller scale, more intimate ones. So he chooses moments of high drama, but juxtaposes those with moments of light relief, to slow down the pace through a lengthy speech, but then also to speed things up with rapid-fire interactions and even those kinds of shared lines and things. Shakespeare also became something of a master of structure in terms of running multiple narrative threads side by side, occasionally interweaving, then bringing them together at the end, often reflecting each other. It's why we run the passionate problems of Hermia, Helena, Lysander and Demetrius alongside the strife between Titania and Oberon and the chilly cordiality of Theseus and Hippolyta. But it's also why the play acted by Bottom and the Mechanicals seems to offer a comedic contrast to the high drama of other moments, and it is eerily clear to Romeo and Juliet. Talking of which, alternatively, there's going to running the central drama of Romeo and Juliet's romance in that play, alongside the family tensions within the Capulet household, the problematic friendship of say, Mercutio and Romeo, the political and social awareness of the friar, and the frustrations of the prince. Each thread plays its part, and it weaves into this cohesive part of the whole. Now, unsurprisingly, Shakespeare also seems to develop a particular focus on certain key themes, on certain key contexts, and on certain characters. In the latter case, character continuity and comparison is a natural part of matching roles to actors, but there's also a clear sense of Lysander, say, being almost like a Romeo in a less developed form, and Romeo being like a less developed Hamlet. Othello is a more nuanced, more sympathetic version of Aaron, the Moor from Titus Andronicus. Lord Capulet's a more sympathetic figure of an Aegeus. Macbeth, who is like an evil Henry IV. Malcolm is a proto-Henry V. Duncan is a Henry VI. Shakespeare also has a tendency to mirror characters within plays. Lysander and Demetrius are sides of a coin. One is charming, romantic, passionate, a little naive. The other is logical, manipulative, more experienced, better at playing the game. Theseus and Aegeus are contrasting authority figures. One powerful but ultimately benevolent and knowing when to allow leniency. The other just controlling, selfish, severe. Hippolyta and Titania, Hermia and Helena. We see similar pairings in other texts. Romeo and Paris, the two tragic lovers. The nurse and Lady Capulet, one not the mother but motherly, the other the mother but not motherly. Juliet and Rosaline, Benvolio, Tybalt, Friar Lawrence and the Apothecary, Macbeth and Macduff, Lady Macbeth and Lady Macduff, Othello and Roderigo. And throughout the plays, Shakespeare seems to sympathise with the underdogs, those able to stand back and reflect on their contexts, and who have often been mistreated, been disappointed or overlooked. Despite the lack of female characters in his plays, those who do appear are often sympathetic or more nuanced than equivalent roles at the time. That's despite how limited they may look from a modern perspective. It's rare to find a character also who's irredeemable. Tybalt is violent but fiercely loyal to his family. Demetrius is rather slimy, I suppose we could say, but he's genuinely emotional and rather sweet to Helena at the end. Iago is manipulative, but with an interiority that prevents him being just a pantomime villain. Macbeth committing evil acts, but horrified by the dawning realization of the consequence of his actions. Now, Shakespeare seems also fascinated by the individual impact of collective issues, the wider conflict as a metaphor for Othello's internal conflict, or how the family feud leads to Romeo and Juliet's internal conflict, moving from the whole world problems of Macbeth, reflected in the natural world, to the individual problems of Macbeth the character, and so on. Deception and reality are recurring themes. We've got idealized versions of love, the assertion or the interrogation of power in terms of its form and function. And often we have the power or powerlessness of individuals. Now you'll notice that these narrative, character and conceptual threads run throughout all the Shakespeare work that we're doing and beyond. Concepts, narrative structures, character roles and vocabulary. These things all link together in our NET curriculum. Now, Shakespeare's plays were intended to be performed. And I know that sounds like a very obvious statement. In the playing companies of the time, actors only received their own lines in a role, their role, from which we take the word role to mean someone's part in a production. This means that everything they needed had to be built in. There are no stage directions, and the writing needs to be memorable for the actor and to follow a sense of flow. Need it be dark? Well, someone has to say it. Need it to be a ship in the middle of the ocean? Well, somebody has to describe it. It's important because it means that more or less everything we need has to be built into the text. It's why Banquo has to ask Fleance to pass him the torch in Act 2 of Macbeth. Why Romeo has to hold the torch to the body of Paris to see who it is in Act 5 of Romeo and Juliet. It's a way of conveying to the audience that it's dark. It's why the witches refer to the weather in Act 1, Scene 1 of Macbeth, though the company would also have used probably something like a wobble board and a cannonball rolling around to make sounds like thunder and rain. Now, to properly understand Shakespeare's writing, we need to hear it out loud. It's how we hear the disruptions and disturbances, the pace, the passion, and on a more basic level it's far easier to hear the rhythms and the rhymes that way. Now, obviously we struggle slightly with changes of pronunciation. In Shakespeare's time, Helena's first speech would have seen her rhyming perfectly. Sickness is catching, oh, a favour so. Yours would I catch, fair Hermia, ere I go. My ear should catch your voice, my eye your eye. My tongue should catch your tongue, sweet melody. I and melody. Melody. They clearly intended to rhyme here, and they would have done for an original audience. I and melody. The same applies to love and move, when Hermia says he gives me love, only for Helena to respond with, oh, that my prayers could such affection move. Loove and move at the time. Now, different linguists have compared Elizabethan pronunciation to everything from Brummie to Kiwi by way of several US states. Suffice to say, it would have sounded rather different to now. Now, as will come as no surprise, it's also worth looking at the language. Students often claim not to understand Shakespeare's words, and there's a problem with that. Something in the region of 90 to 95% of the words used in Shakespeare's plays are still used now, and they used to mean something relatively similar. There are certain high-frequency words that can be defined quickly and easily, thou and thee, for example, and those act as informal subject and object pronouns in Shakespeare's time against the more formal you. And that means that if students can get used to mentally hearing you whenever the text says thou, well, that issue can be essentially taken off the table. Hearing what's the news with you rather than what's the news with thee can feel far more familiar and accessible and therefore less threatening. Other words are almost the same as modern words. So when the word hath appears, for example, encouraging students to guess at what it could be, and they usually arrive at has within 2 or 3 guesses, with the sentence and the grammar both offering some significant clues. One idea is, as with the poetry, to ignore the versification and to put quotations into prose. So when Demetrius attempts to dismiss Helena, offering the students, do I entice you? Do I speak you fair? Or rather do I not, in plainest truth, tell you I do not, nor I cannot love you? Rather than, do I entice you? Do I speak you fair? Or rather do I not, in plainest truth, tell you I do not, nor I cannot love you? It's clumsier with the end stopping, and it's more confusing visually. As an alternative, it can be useful to break down that fear of the strange words by breaking down a section even further. For example, if we take all the words from Act 1, Scene 1 of Macbeth, there are 61 in total. Of these, there are possibly 6 that students might not know, despite most of them still being in use now, and you can see them on the screen. Now that means that students know 90% of the words. Phrased another way, it's often not the words that are the problem, it's the syntax, it's the word order. And even words with which students are unfamiliar can be deciphered. I mean, students may not know, for example, what a heath is, but when it appears in the interaction where the place upon the heath, it's a fairly safe bet that the heath is a place, and a place where witches would meet, so deserted, away from people, and so on. Similarly, we may not be able to work out that Grey Malkin is a cat, the witch is familiar, but when the witch says, I come, Grey Malkin, it's clearly something or someone that's waiting for her, and that has the intelligence to understand what she's saying, which narrows things down a lot. Now, the same vocabulary approaches can be used as in the schemes that we teach, so breaking down the word, seeing the word in context, and so on. So when, for example, the chorus at the start of Romeo and Juliet uses the word piteous, well, students may not get the full meaning, but the fact that it starts with pity may take them quite a lot of the way to get there. Now, syntax can be tricky since it can impact quite significantly on meaning. Sometimes simply rearranging the words can straighten out the issue, such as in Helena's question, "Call you me fair?" When hearing it as "you call me fair" would make it again far easier to understand, and I don't quite know where that touch of a Yorkshire accent came from. The dream, obviously, is for students to understand every word, but that's often unrealistic. What can be more productive as an access point is to encourage students to see it from an overview perspective. So a student may not fully understand, say, every word of Brabantio's accusations aimed at Othello, but if they can pick out the words thief, enchanted, charms and drugs, well, they can end up with a pretty good idea of what he's accusing Othello of doing. Or later on, when Iago describes Desdemona as having so free, so kind, so apt, so blessed a disposition, she holds it a vice in her goodness not to do more than she's requested. Well, again, students may not understand the full meaning, but they might spot a semantic field or a lexical thread in the use of free, kind, apt, blessed, goodness. It's a positive description of her generosity. It's also useful for students to have an understanding of the narrative and the characters before they grapple with the text. And that's a good point in a scheme to make the comparisons, to help students see the character archetypes that mirror more modern texts, the influence of Shakespeare's characters on things they recognise, and so on, as that early access point. Now, in terms of narrative understanding, in a theatre, the action and the acting would carry this through. In a classroom, there can be several different ways of doing this. Now, obviously, students can be given a modern language version of the text, though that deviates from the subtlety of the meaning and can often lead to some confusion and some misquotation if you don't handle it very carefully. Now, to push that a bit further, a whoosh drama can also be good fun, which is getting the students to act out the narrative and the character roles in a very short, accessible, paraphrased version, with the teacher doing the narration and all the speech, and without any students therefore needing to speak. They're just acting out what the teacher tells them to. And you'll recognise that from the Key Stage 3 Shakespeare schemes, if you've seen those. Now, ensuring engagement with characters can also be very useful, if not, if I'm honest, crucial. Keeping, for example, an ever-expanding profile of key characters as you work through the text, or using, say, images of characters that recur whenever that character is referenced on the screen, or presented as part of the text or the task. And the idea of kind of visual continuity, so there's familiarity with the students they're building up throughout the study of the text. Now, another idea, as with the poetry in the previous session, is to keep a sense of debate and discussion going through offering what I call provocations. Statements that, a bit like Language 1, Question 4, students need to respond to. So, for example, Demetrius doesn't deserve to be happy at the end of the play. Othello should be blamed as much as Iago. The tragedy in Romeo and Juliet all boils down to the prince failing to address the problem properly. Or, despite his evil actions, we never fully lose our sympathy for Macbeth. Now, to cut through all of this, the important things with students would be to break through that perceived barrier of Shakespeare being old and complicated and weird, to engage students with narrative and character first, then to layer up analysis and evaluation later. It's that sort of biting point, focusing on character and narrative predominantly with a little bit of analysis, and then flipping that as they become more confident. And that's to build up their skills and their confidence in deciphering words. And finally, also to encourage students to see the writing as simply text on a page or text read out loud, just another piece of text, as with poetry, as with prose, as with non-fiction. Now, certainly within all the Shakespeare schemes within NET, it's important to remember that students are studying a Shakespeare play, but they're also using it as a vehicle to engage with Shakespeare as a writer more generally, and also as a hub for the study of wider textual genres and comparisons, and most importantly, as a vehicle for the analytical and the interpretive skills that run through everything we study. And this does, obviously, also proceed naturally and fluidly to building and layering and following the themes and vocabulary from lesson to lesson, from scheme to scheme, and from year to year. And that's all from me for now. It's been quite a long session, so thanks for your time and your attention. Hopefully there's been some useful and some interesting content in there. But there'll also be further exploration of how to apply all of this in the next session, which will be led by the superb Ashley Potts. Now, for the moment, thank you for your time. Do direct any questions or queries to heads of department or to directors. And if you are looking for some further reading around the topic, I very strongly recommend the text on the screen. A couple there in terms of Teaching Shakespeare, so Teaching Shakespeare by Rex Gibson, Shakespeare, How to Cure It by Ralph Cohen, it's very good. If you're looking for stuff about the Shakespearean context, there is of course Shakespeare, The World as a Stage by Bill Bryson, which is very, very readable. Personal favourites, there's Ian Mortimer's The Time Traveller's Guide to Elizabethan England, if you're looking for general context around the time. And if you're looking for a couple of films to watch from an audio-visual perspective, obviously there is Tom Stoppard's Shakespeare in Love, which is a bit of a classic, and a bit of fun, but still some insight. There is, of course, Bill, which is by the Horrible Histories team. Thank you very much, and take care.